Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the allied Tion sector. The Tion hegemony was one of the first sectors outside of the core to be incorporated into the Republic, and it was the Republic's first victory against the Hutt Empire, although an indirect one. Then in the Clone Wars, the Tion hegemony was the capital sector of the CIS. The victorious Empire split the hegemony into a half-dozen sectors to weaken them, and Allied Tion was one of the sectors made from that split. Allied Tion sort of corresponds to the old three allied kingdoms of Jaminir, Cadenth, and Barseg that served as a buffer state between the Kron Kingdom and the Livian League, but this is pretty far in the weeds of history even for people born and raised in the Tion cluster. Like, everyone from the Tion cluster knows about Zim the Despot, but even in Tion, the only people who know about the three allied kingdoms are the kinds of people who watch pop education vids on the HoloNet, you nerds. The people of the Tion cluster still mostly think of themselves as a single united sector, but their new sector governments don't agree on which one of them should be the sector's central government in the New Republic, so they remain split. Allied Tion doesn't even match up completely to the old allied kingdoms, so don't be surprised if some planets from the Kingdom of Kron show up. Like, Amarin is an old hunting reserve that was originally part of the Kingdom of Kron before Zim conquered it for his empire, which eventually became the Tion hegemony after Zim died and they had to figure out what their identity was going to be now that they were no longer the personal project of one man who was really good at conquering planets. Being the cradle of one of the most ancient galactic civilizations, the whole Tion cluster has a huge number of major worlds, to the point where it's hard to know which ones to bother mentioning. It feels weird to completely ignore planets with hundreds of millions or billions of inhabitants, but also these planets were packed so close to one another that the history of one is mostly also the history of the others. Things that happened on one planet also affected the rest, so... Lightning round. Dersagor is a mountainous mining planet. Dravion is one of the first worlds conquered by Zim the Despot, an agri-world that's mostly unimportant except for the Zim-era archaeology facilitated by the well-preserved ruins of ancient arrays built there and preserved since the pre- to early Republic era due to the low temperatures and thin air of the mountain peaks. Emberil has a mild climate similar to Naboo and is almost completely covered in aristocratic estates, some of which date back to the era of Zim. Jantoria is where the Livian League fought Zim. They lost, they make real good wine. Spinax 3 is a water world home to an ancient tradition of Leviathan hunting, but heavy pollution of the oceans killed the last of the Leviathans during the High Republic period, and now it's basically just a giant ball of toxic sludge. According to legend, the Gormak used to be the only species on the planet of Voss when the Sith Empire found and subjugated it. The Jedi drove the Sith off and taught several of the Gormak the ways of the Force so they could defend themselves in the future, and apparently this was so taxing on the Gormak that it rapidly evolved them into a new Voss species over the course of just a few generations. Evolution doesn't work that way, so I'm skeptical, but certainly by the time of the Galactic Cold War many centuries later, the planet had two distinct species on it, the more material Gormak and the more mystical Voss. The conflict became a proxy war, with the Sith supporting the Gormak and the Republic supporting the Voss, but the conflict was eventually resolved peacefully when both sides found a common enemy in the Eternal Empire. I remain skeptical of a lot of the details of the Eternal Empire, and I don't think their presence here is even necessary to explain the resolution of the Gormak-Voss conflict. Most wars have a negotiated end after both sides fight each other to exhaustion, with the side who got the worst of the fighting being forced to make more concessions but not being subjugated completely. Anyway, the only part of the Eternal Fleet that's hard to believe is that the origins of their fleet are allegedly from a slightly different Starforge made by an unrelated ancient lost civilization from the one who made the actual Starforge, and none of those details have any impact on their ability to have a fleet at all, or to use that fleet to attack Voss, thus uniting the two species and putting an end to their conflict. Corlax 4 is a middlingly important industrial planet that joined the CIS with Barseg. According to rumor, then-Chancellor Palpatine ordered Jedi Master Darius Jet to destroy the planet's industrial capacity, something which would wipe out most of the planet's hundreds of millions of inhabitants in the process. Darius Jet ultimately refused to carry out the plan. This seems pretty fishy to me, though. Like, in the first few weeks of the Clone Wars, Palpatine is already trying to carry out planetary genocides, and he decides to entrust this massive escalation of violent authoritarianism to a Jedi Master? The plan did fail, so maybe Palpatine massively overestimated the galaxy's appetite for destruction in the early stages of the Clone Wars. But I find it hard to believe that Palpatine was that inept a manipulator all the way back at the dawn of the Clone Wars. It would take several years of vicious warfare for the core worlds to work up an appetite for the kind of carnage that the Republic engaged in at around the time it was reorganized into the Empire, and it sure seems like Palpatine always knew that would be the case, seeing as how he engineered an entire multi-year war rather than a short-lived crisis like the invasion of Naboo had been. He knew that something short wouldn't work up that kind of bloodlust in the core worlds. Barseg was the capital of the Kingdom of Barseg, which continued to exist on paper up until the High Republic era. The Tion hegemony was nominally a feudal empire and successor state to Zim the Despot, but Zim didn't really leave any instructions for how to appoint a successor before he got himself killed or maybe enslaved or otherwise neutralized while fighting the Hutts. So despite nominally being a hegemony ruled by a hegemon, the Tion hegemony was an ugly compromise between a bunch of different aristocratic traditions who had been jammed together by the conquest of Zim and didn't want to disintegrate and present an easy target to the Ascendant Hutts. When this ball of border gore held together by twine encountered the early Republic, they fought a war and the Republic won, but the Republic didn't land armies in all the throne worlds and subjugate the Tion hegemony. The Tion hegemony got the worst of it and realized that if they tried to fight the Republic, they would end up sliced up between the Republic and the Hutt Empire, and decided to surrender to the Republic while they still had some negotiating power. That resulted in a negotiated surrender, but because the Tion hegemony had the wisdom to negotiate and the early Republic was much less committed to requiring democracy from prospective new sectors compared to the old and especially High Republic, the Tion hegemony was able to grandfather in all kinds of aristocratic bullshit when they joined the Republic as a sector. And that included the Kingdom of Barseg, one of the Tion hegemony's member states, ruling over planets like Liana and Lorad as feudal properties. Lorad in particular was, despite being a major world with lots of major urban population centers, technically not a member world of the Republic, but instead a subjugated vassal of a Republic sector. And that lasted clear into the High Republic era, when the Republic finally decided to clean that up. Barseg's rigid caste system persisted on cultural momentum despite the democratic reforms of the High Republic and the economic reforms of the Late Republic. Of all the aristocratic traditions bound together in the Tion hegemony, Barseg was always the one who hated the Republic the most, proud of their imperial past and resentful of the reforms imposed upon their rigidly authoritarian society by Republic idealists. So, unsurprisingly, Barseg was a strong supporter of the CIS. They were relatively untouched by the Clone Wars since they were within the perimeter that the CIS capital in Tion was able to maintain even during the Outer Rim sieges behind planets like Felucia, Colomex, and Ossus. And they surrendered rather than fight to the death like CIS holdouts on planets like Megiddo or Siskine. Barseg and the rest of the Tion cluster weren't spared the wrath of the Empire in the aftermath, though. The expense of rebuilding the economy was foisted onto separatist worlds as much as possible, especially the Tion cluster, who still had a powerful economy to loot. Liana is a major trade world along the Prelemian trade route, one whose economic power quickly eclipsed that of their old feudal lords on Barseg during the Late Republic era. This made Liana a strong supporter of the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars, which went extraordinarily poorly for them, seeing as they were in the heart of separatist territory. Liana's wealth meant they had a pretty powerful planetary defense force, but not so powerful that they could stand up to a galactic power like the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The whole planet was left in ruins, and when the Empire ransacked the Tion cluster to fund reconstruction, the priority was in repairing core worlds whose economies had burnt out from the manic war production required to keep up with the CIS, leaving Republic loyalists in the Outer Rim like Liana mostly to fend for themselves. Luckily for Liana, they were still located on the Prelemian trade route, so they were able to make enough money to fund their own reconstruction, and wound up a major producer of TIE fighters in the Imperial era. The Allied Tion sector is mostly the territory of the old allied kingdoms of the Tion cluster, Barseg, Jamanir, and Cadenth, who allied with one another in an attempt to stave off domination by the Kron kingdom, the dominant power in the Tion cluster at the time, and later Zim the Despot, who took over the Kron kingdom. The allied kingdoms did pretty good against the Kronese and got shellacked by Zim. Cadenth was the official fourth throne of Zim, the provincial capital of the former territories of the three allied kingdoms under the Tion hegemony, and the de jure capital of the allied Tion sector, although Liana quickly came to overshadow it economically. Cadenth declared neutrality in the Clone Wars, and the Empire mostly ignored them afterwards, but they did pointedly not make them the capital of the allied Tion sector, since they were trying to dismantle the Tion hegemony, whose ancient traditions were rooted in being the first 4 of the 8 thrones of Zim. Instead, the Empire gave the capital to Jamanir, the last of the 3 allied kingdoms of the pre-Zim era, and the capital of the Jamanir March. The Jamineer March was a short-lived state formed when Jamineer tried to break away from the Tion hegemony after Zim's death. They successfully captured the territory of their old allies in Cadenth and Barseg and held onto it for several years, but ultimately the Jamineer March, as it was called, was just a temporary convulsion of the Tion cluster after Zim's death, and Jamineer's position in the hegemony's border gore wasn't particularly more prominent than that of Cadenth or Barseg. Jamineer might have defeated the official 4th throne of Zim, but the other 7 thrones liked the idea that being a throne of Zim granted legitimacy in the Tion hegemony, and didn't like the idea that a sufficiently gutsy planet could replace a throne by pure force of arms. The Empire tried to revive the Jamineer March because of its combination of being nearly as old as the thrones of Zim, a few decades isn't much of a difference to events from thousands of years ago, and its being explicitly opposed to the aristocratic order of the Tion hegemony, which bases itself in the throne worlds of Zim the Despot. Under the Tion hegemony, Cadenth is the 3rd throne and Jamineer is just another planet, but under the Jamineer March and subsequently under the Galactic Empire, Jamineer is the capital. The Empire liked to encourage these ancient fractious divisions, especially within the Tion hegemony. And just like the aristocrats of Zim's thrones held the Tion hegemony together after his death because being thrones had given them power for 20 years and none of them were particularly excited about giving it up, the sector government of the allied Tion sector wasn't interested in giving up power after the fall of the Empire. There's no record of exactly what happened afterwards, which, for events this recent, that usually means there was a lot of violence and it wasn't particularly well organized. The Tion hegemony remains fractured, and allied Tion in particular remains capital that of Jamineer, specifically because that spits in the face of the 4 thrones of the old Tion hegemony.